Hello, everyone. So I'm so happy that you're here, and thank you to everyone who made it to the class tonight. I did have my vaccine last night, and I was having a little bit of like brain fog and completely forgot to hit record. So I'm just going to re-record it so you can all have the class, and anyone who missed will be able to follow along. So basically, I did this tonight, and I've actually just redrawn my fish darker because I realized looking at the video, it's quite light, my drawing on my paper. And I do that so that it doesn't interfere with my painting after. So I'm going to actually use a darker version because I think it's going to be easier for you to see for my demo. But just please note that I wouldn't draw my drawing that dark. So I'm using the Canson XL paper. It is a challenging one to get washes. So I'm going to show a technique that will give you something that's fairly subtle on this paper without destroying the surface too much. So my goal with this, and I started with the wash so that it would be easier to sort of clean later as we do the fish and the lily pads. So yeah, I wanted something that was kind of like interesting color variation throughout the water, but not too many blooms and not too many distracting details, but just some sort of nice texture to it. So it's not sort of like a boring wash, but I didn't want to distract too much from what was going to be going on with the line work with the fish and everything. I wanted to sort of like recede back into the image. And I'm just going to share my screen quickly because I wanted to go through sort of how I went about designing this painting. And where my references come from. So I usually, before I start a painting, I usually go to Pinterest, not to copy anything specifically, just to sort of brainstorm ideas. And so what I was looking for in developing this, I had a couple goals in mind. I wanted something that was sort of Japanese style because I was painting koi fish. However, I didn't want it to look like classical Japanese watercolor painting. As much as I love it, these nice like muted tones and very delicate sort of brushwork. I wanted something that looked a little bit more modern and a little bit punchier, so almost toward tattoo, which is where the sort of illustrative stylized black line work comes in. So with that in mind, I just started collecting every image I could find that I just kind of liked without really editing at all. And I really created a huge bank. And as I go through all of this, you will see that there's a huge variety of images. And what I'm looking for are themes that are going to start popping out at me of things that I might want to use. And I'm looking to develop a kind of visual language that I can use to develop the style for these pieces. This is not necessarily my style of painting. This is a style decision that I took for these pieces. So it's really important when you're doing something like that to really analyze and understand your choices so that if someone were to commission me a piece of another subject matter in this style, I would be able to sort of repeat that style. And I literally just took everything I could find. So in terms of visual language that I was looking for, I was really drawn to these lines, sort of abstracted lines for the ripples on the water. I really liked that they could kind of create a compositional element that could be used on a diagonal and kind of help lead our eye around the painting. I also really liked the sort of bright, vibrant color palettes in these images here. As much as I really like the wash look of watercolor for some things, because I was going so hard edge on these, I didn't want the blooms and things, but I did kind of like sort of these soft blends. I thought that they could be good with the more graphic style. Yeah, stuff like this was kind of interesting and sort of pushing more into the modern feel. I really liked the line works that I was seeing in some of these black and white drawings. There's some really cute little watercolors here. You guys can follow my board if you want. I will actually put a link to it in the next email so that you can just go check everything out and follow along. Yeah, and then there were down here, little bit farther. Sometimes I take things that I think might be relevant, but they're not necessarily. It's really just to have like a brain dump as a starting point. So in terms of the koi design, I really love koi that have all of these various patchwork and patterns, and you can really use these when you're drawing your koi to help follow around the volumes of the body. And it really sort of helps to stylize. Here, I really like this sort of minimalist palette with the black and the white, and I wanted to keep an element of that in my drawing. I also really liked the exaggerated scales on these fish, on these styles. And then these are sort of the fish that I was looking at to use. So I will go over some ideas on how to draw, or some helpful hints on how to draw these things. But I did trace this one for this particular koi. That said, I stylized it quite a bit. I've changed the fins quite a bit on it. I've exaggerated the tail on it, and I've completely changed the marking. So if you were to look at my koi fish and then look at this photo, you might not recognize that it's actually sort of the same basic shape of fish. And I was really just using it as a base shape. So I think that that's where kind of pulling things from Pinterest and the internet is sort of allowed, because you're using it really to reference, but then building your own thing from it. So that's how I built, or those are the references that I used to come up with this design and this style and these particular fish. And then I just wanted to show also my drawing, the way I structured it was just basically using the rule of thirds. So I have the head shape falling in this quadrant, the lower third quadrant. And then the tail curves back around through this top quadrant and then reaches up over into this third. And then I've got these set of lily pads, which are counterbalanced by this set of lily pad. And these are taking up the third, and then this is sort of taking up that little bottom third there. And then I have this diagonal line with those ripples, sort of helping to lead the eye through the painting this way and then back around. So we kind of have this circular composition. And I did the same thing on the original piece. It's a little bit less tight for the rule of thirds, but I have this grouping of lily pads counterbalancing this sort of grouping over here. And then I have the fish's head starting in the rule of third on this side, and then it curves around here. And then we kind of have these diagonal lines and the space around the lily pads kind of helping to bring the eye around. One important little thing about composition is to sort of leave the corners empty. You don't want, this is close right here. I have a line going out to the corner. You don't want any dramatic lines leading out of your canvas. So with that said, we are going to get painting. So we are going to do this fish. So this was the design that I had come up with for the colors and the scales on this one. And I actually just, because we're still talking about style, I wanted to show you some of my like tests and failed attempts, because I always do a whole lot of testing before I go crazy with my work. This was an early failed test. I was just testing out some ideas for water, and like I was trying one idea here and one idea there. It's basically a mess, but it helps me to make some decisions for my work. So I was thinking about water droplets, and because the shape of the fish is so round and they're always curving, I wanted to stick with the rounded shapes. This though was going to be too much, and then I mean the scale, if I changed it, might have been okay, but it just seemed too like circular. And so that's when I preferred the sort of lines for the sort of more tranquil water of those Japanese paintings. And then I liked the pen work that I came up with on this sort of group of lily pads, but I didn't really like the flowers. I found them too angular. They all of a sudden go into a point, and it just sort of broke the visual language that I was developing. And so I then went on to do these drawings just to try out some different ideas, but I ended up a little bit too sort of geometric in my lily pads. But I was, however, liking these shapes a lot better for my flowers. They're a little bit softer and rounder. So I ended up going with these sort of shapes for the flowers. And then, for example, here's one of the little flowers that I did. And as you can see, it's just sort of more rounded shapes. It might have been this one sort of based on that there. And then for the lily pads, I sort of took the idea of these failed ones here in terms of line work, but then I found the shape to be a little bit uninteresting, and I thought it might be more interesting if the ships were, or the ships, if the fish were a little bit like not straight on, but a little bit on an angle view in terms of perspective. It would just give a little bit of backward step. So I ended up sort of doing these shapes where it's sort of tilted on an axis, and then I've got a few little organic things happening and just some broken lines, and they're not perfect circles. So I just thought it added a little bit to the charm of the visual language. And now that I have all these done, and I have all these decisions made, I can then go and plan to do other pieces. So that's sort of how I work and how I brainstorm and come up with things. And it might seem like a lot of work in the beginning, but it's worth it, I think, to get to something that's kind of solid and that you can repeat and sort of come up with your own ideas. So we're going to be working on this water today, and then we'll be working on the fish next week. And so let me see, I'm actually going to try to turn this light down because I'm finding on Zoom, my camera is compensating for dark. There we go. I think that's a little bit better. So as I said, this is drawn out now way darker than is necessary for a watercolor painting. We are going over it. Yeah, you just can't pick up the pencil. So I'm just going to do it dark like this for you guys. The water, we are going to be outlining things, so it's actually not that bad in this particular case. This is going to be horrendous. So just really light outlining, please, on your work. Otherwise, we're going to see that pencil through. And okay, so on my particular palette, so you don't need to be using necessarily the same colors as me, but I was going for sort of like a theme in my colors. And I wanted to do something, because we're doing a complementary palette painting, I wanted to do something that had mainly blues because of the oranges in the fish, but then I was turning my shadows in the fish to the red. So I wanted to add a little bit of green. So kind of nice aqua green colors. And in terms of brushes on this, I was actually using an angled flat brush, which may seem completely peculiar. And I was also using sort of round brushes, just like this, to get into the little details. And then I have this sort of really fat, soft brush that holds a lot of water. And to be honest, this is an old makeup brush, and it's been working really, really well for my watercolors. So I'm actually going to be using my flat brush. I just find, because I haven't put any masking fluid, that it's just really easy for me to get along these edges. So I do apologize, because this is probably the pencil is on here so hard it might actually bleed out a little bit, but just know that this dark pencil is for the demo. All right, so to do my background, and it's going to be slightly different on the different papers that you have. If you have a 100% cotton paper, it might actually be easier to control this. You might need to add a little bit more water than I do. With this Canson paper, the pigment really tends to stick on top of the paper, and it's really easy to remove it. So I don't want to work it too much when it's wet. I just want to kind of work it once and not touch it, and then let it dry. So I'm just actually going to go in and wet my paper. And I just want kind of a sheen on here. And I might even do this again before because I haven't mixed up my pigments yet. But they were all nice and fresh and wet earlier. Now I've let them dry, so I might have to do this in a couple steps. But I'm just going to wet the paper and just carefully cut around those edges. The reason why I chose not to edge those off is because I wanted something that wasn't as hard edged. Because it is water, I wanted it to be a little bit softer. So I'm actually just trying to be fairly careful about cutting in around these. And I'm just going to make sure my paper is fairly damp, just because I don't want my pigment my pigments to sit in too quickly to the paper because I want them to sort of bleed a little bit and blend around. All right, so for the colors, I've got cerulean blue, and I've got, actually, it's called royal blue from Pentel. This is really old, really cheap paint. I don't even know how archival it is, and I'll explain why. That's not really what my interest was while I was doing this series later. But I'm using the Winsor Newton Coatman student brand. And I've got their cerulean blue, and then I've got that blue, and it's just kind of like a nice bright cool blue. So I'm just going to start adding a fair amount of paint. I almost made like a paste out of it. It's got water, but it's not too it's not too watered down, and it's not too thick. And the reason why I do that with this particular paper for this particular technique is because I want enough pigment to go down in my first pass. Otherwise, if I go in and rework it, I'm just going to end up in trouble because it's going to move again. So I'm just sort of laying this out here. I'm going to add a tiny little bit of water, and then I'm going to go in and I'm going to add some ultramarine blue just to sort of warm up some areas here. And now if you're going to make any brush strokes for this, I would suggest going in the same direction that your lines are going, your diagonals are going, so that we have the same sort of flow across the page. You don't want to go contrary to that. I'm now just using a bit of the Prussian blue and a little bit of my Viridian green just to sort of make this a little bit more aqua. Just to bring in some of those deeper green colors. And again, I'm just gonna, I'm being a little bit sloppy. I'm sorry, I'm going a little bit quickly, but I'll clean this up later. I'm just gonna sort of bring this across. I don't want to touch it too much because it's gonna start giving me funny stuff. I don't want to edge that too much either. All right. So this part, it's dried a little bit. So I'm just actually gonna go in and gently re-wet this. You could clean your brush fully just to make sure that you're not sort of contaminating. I'm going to go in basically with the same blue, so I'm not as worried. And I'm going to make that a little bit more intense by adding that light blue mix back in. There is, okay, so I have some blooming here, and it's because I added more water and it just pushed into this little part up here. So I'm just going to sort of get rid of it while I have a chance. So you got to watch out for the quantity of water, especially when you're putting it next to other water that's a little bit more dry. So when I wet these pigments again to get new colors, I'm making sure that they're more of a paste than watery, because I don't want the fresh water to sort of create a bloom effect. And then again, I'm adding my more green tone down here. I'm trying to create a vignette so it's brighter in towards the center of the fish. Oops. And then it's darker towards the corners. So I'm just going to make sure my paper is wet here. And again, like with my actual painting, these lines, we won't see them in the end. They're drawn very lightly, so you won't see the pencil. I'm just trying to make it so you can see, but it'll change the effect quite a bit. Adding the cerulean blue so that it kind of matches across my lily pads are across the water. And then I'm going to go in with my blue-green mix here. So my Prussian blue and my Viridian. So if you don't have these colors, it's not too big of a deal. You just need to grab your cool and warm blue colors, whatever you have on hand, and also a nice bright blue. And you can have the same effect with a different palette. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. I would just sort of make a rule that it should be sort of bright to dark and sort of a nice mix of warm and cool blues. And then I'm just going to fill in over here, and I want to try to match up as a little bit too much water. I just need a sheen. I don't want it to be pooling. Just going to go in and add the cerulean, this bright blue over here. And a little bit of that ultramarine on this side. And once it's down, I don't want to touch it too much. I want it to sort of do its thing and blend on its own. If I touch it, I'm going to make a mess. Let's do this big chunk over here. So I'm just going to wet it all. Got a little bit of paint on my brush. So this is mostly going to be that bright cerulean blue, nice and close to the fish there. I know that this this nice cerulean color is pretty close and complementary to the bright sort of cadmium orange red that I have, which is why I'm keeping it closer to the fish. It's going to help make that pop a little bit. All right, and I'm going to take my nice bright blues here and drop them in, cutting around the fish. And again, I'm trying to move as much as possible in the direction of those little ripples. Got to be careful a little bit with these angled brushes because they can leave angled marks, and this is water, so that doesn't really make sense. It might work on a rock or something, but on water, it's not the best. So it is something to be aware of and careful of. And I'm just going to go and add some of my Prussian and ultramarine in there to give that sort of vignette effect. And I might just tilt this. I have some water on this side. Just let that bleed in. And get in over here in that little spot that I've missed. A little bit of that cerulean blue in here. That's maybe a little bit much paint. Just going to wipe some of it out so it's sort of a similar value to the paint on the other side. There we go. That matches a little bit better. So this is a little bit much for me right now, this bloom that's happened, but we're going to go in and sort of soften that out later when we add some more texture. I'm still just sort of trying to go for like a clean gradient across the page. So I'm going to come in here around this flower. And I think I'll go a little bit darker. So I think I'm going to just stick and sort of intermix between these colors now with the cerulean blue, the Prussian blue, and the ultramarine blue. A little bit darker on the side. A little bit more pigment there. And then up in the top, let this out. So while you do this at home, please feel free to take a little bit more time than what I'm doing. I'm kind of rushing through it a little bit quickly. You'll be able to get a cleaner, you'll be able to get cleaner work and better edges and things if you just take a little bit more time. You have to work kind of quickly with the water, but maybe not this quickly. All right, so on this part, I'm going to sort of go with my ultramarine blue mix here. Make sure there's enough pigment in there. Get in nice and close there. And then I'm going to go in with some more of the green, the Viridian green. Let's add a little bit more. Into here. Just going to soften this little edge. It's better if it's softer. It'll disappear more instead of creating a hard edge on the painting there. So around this side, so we need sort of the same mix in next to that tail there. I'm just going to soften this out a bit. This might create a balloon, but we'll deal with it later. Go in to these little areas. And this one, I want it to be fairly close in color because they're next to each other. Maybe lightening a little bit. And then I'm going to come up in here. And then I'll go around the fish after. So again, on the side, I think I'll try to remain in this sort of darker color so I get that vignetting effect. And then into the cerulean blue next to the fish. So this is probably the part of the whole process that you guys are going to be the most familiar with out of this little class. Get a little bit more pigment there. I want to go dark enough off the bat so I don't have to retouch it. And then I'm going to go in a little bit more of that ultramarine. And then in here, remove some of the water. There's quite a bit of water in my brush right now. I'm going to come in here with this cerulean. And let this sort of blend in through here. A little bit more pigment. And just over here, I'm going to go back in with a little bit more of that dark blue, just so that it matches around the side of that water ripple there. And then in around the fish, I'm actually just going to take my little round brush and get some of my lighter cerulean color here. And maybe just wet the paper a little bit at first. I just want to dampen it again. It's going to help the pigment move over the surface. Go a little bit darker. I don't want to add really more water. I just want a little bit more pigment. That's a lot of pigment. Blur that out. And I'm just going to use it here because it's a little bit much. These are little areas, so you don't necessarily need to wet the paper for those. I'm just sort of filling them in. And in here. And in over here. I'm just trying to catch all those extra little areas that I missed. And then there's some just in through here, and I don't actually want to touch my wet paper because it will leave a handprint. So I'm just going to turn it and get in here between this little lily pad and the tail and the flower. All right. And it doesn't want to, it's because of the white, it's not wanting to focus. I'm just going to put a fish there because it likes to focus on the contrast. There we go. Perfect. So now we've got some decent little bleeds and blends going on. I'm just going to let this sit for a minute. And what we're going to do next is just kind of create some subtle texture on the surface just by disrupting it a little bit. So I don't want something, like I said, that's going to be too overpowering, but this is a little bit smooth for my liking. I have some nice little bleeds and things going on. They're not really, at the moment, they're not sort of consistent everywhere. So I'm actually just going to go in with a paper towel, and I'm going to put a little bit of water on it so that it's damp. So if I were to do this with a brush, especially on this paper, it would actually leave lines, and I don't want any lines. So I'm actually going to start down here where it's a little bit drier already. If it's too wet, you're going to pull out too much water. And then I'm just sort of dabbing into this, and I can soften. I need a little bit more water on here. It needs to be enough that it's going to sort of redamp and pick up the paint, but it's not going to damage it too much. So I'm just going to like kind of soften this out there, and it just kind of gives almost like a little shimmer to the surface where it just sort of picks up the surface of the paper or the texture of the paper, and you can just kind of blot out some of the harder edges a little bit. Again, be careful because it will go back to white. See there, I'm starting to go a little bit too far, but I think I'll just do the same on the other side. Just to give a little bit of movement and a little bit of extra texture on that paper. And over here where it's a little bit less polished looking, dab into there a little bit. It almost gives like a cloud effect. And over here where I have this bloom that's sort of interesting, but is a little bit much, I'm going to go in and sort of soften this out and pick some up. And then I'll show you another similar technique. to add a little bit of pigment back in. So I'm going a little bit far to clean that up. And I'm going to carry the same sort of pattern on the other side here. It's okay if I'm getting a little bit of blue on my lily pad there for now. Just soften that out, and then in here, just sort of soften. I kind of like that blue area. I might leave it in here. I'm liking it a bit less so I'm just going to add a little bit of on the side, just a little bit of variation into that. Just to kind of give something that has some interesting texture to it. All right, so if I want to add a little bit more pigment in there, and I think in this case, I want to add these cerulean, or these lighter blues here. I'm going to take some of the pigment that's pretty wet and just actually apply it. And the reason why I'm doing it this way is because I know if I go with a brush over that, it's really going to give me some lines. But with this, I can just kind of dab back in and just deposit very gently some of that pigment. In a very soft way. So it kind of gets rid of that white and just helps to add a little bit of extra texture. Maybe in here too. It's almost like stippling. Just adding very subtle color over top. Nice and subtle. In here too. A little bit more on there. You got to be careful if you drip water on the paper. If you dab over it with this now, it is going to just lift and give you white. So I've got some more blue, maybe up in here. Maybe kind of pale in spots. So I'm just gonna dab in some extra color. All right. And then I will put my little fish back on it. It's going to help the light focus. There we go. So now you can kind of see that texturing a little bit more. If this is still a bit rough, we can just like continue going back in. I can actually add some of the green color. Finding that spot to be a little bit rough still. So some of the ultramarine blue mixed with the Prussian blue. Damp this. In this area, I just find it a little bit rough. I went a little bit far with that too, but I will just dab it. You don't want to pull it, you just want to kind of dab. This is sort of the fun part of all of this. All right. A little bit darker in the corner, maybe. And I'm going to come over here and just soften this little area. And maybe a little bit up in here. Actually, I'm going to go a little bit darker just to help with that vignetting. Add a little bit more of that Prussian blue, and maybe I'll add a little bit of that burgundy green also onto the paper towel, just like that. And very, very gently. That was pretty dark, so I'm just going to dab a little bit off. And just very gently sort of tap that into the paper. I'm sure you could find all sorts of things with cool textures on them for this sort of technique. And a little bit up in here to balance out the sides. There we go. So now I've got some subtle blending and texturing going on. From here, I'm going to take that brown brush and I'm going to go in with a small, very small amount of pigment of that bright blue, but a lot of water. I just actually want a color that's fairly watered down. So that would be too much, for example. So I'm going to add more water to this. I want something more like this. And we're going to go in now and paint into our little ripples that go across. And the reason why I waited until the end to do these is because I can go in now and sort of go back and forth over any like spills or mishaps that I had or anywhere where I went over the lines. And it will just sort of soften them out and take them away. Again, don't draw them in as hard as I have here, but at least you can see them on the video. Of color with a lot of water. I did wait, so my surrounding areas are pretty dry now. They're definitely completely dry to the touch, so they won't move too much. I'm not going to get any real bloom happening. I do want to make sure I don't dab it now though, or set my hand on it while it's sort of drying. I'm going to go across here. This is across the fin of the fish here, so I'm going to go across it because it's above the fin of the fish. And I'm looking for sort of a defined edge on these, but also fairly soft. I'll go in over here, so over that little part of the fish there. And I just went over the lines a little bit right here, so I'm just going to blur that out. I'm going to try turning that light down. See if we can. There we go. Keeps adapting. And over the fish. Oops, way too much paint. So I'm just going to put a bit of water. It's safe to dab that off there. I'm just going to do it. I don't have anything that's too wet around it. And clean up this little spot here. Go over the fish nice and carefully. And then come over here. Dab that away. I went over the fish a little bit too much. Go to my lines. And I might actually sort of darken it a little bit to these edges. so they become a little bit lighter in towards the fish, just to help keep the eye on the page. You don't really want to leave the eye completely off the page. A little bit more pigment in there. And so over here, I'll darken it up just a little bit over here. And I'm going to wipe off some of the pigment because I want to create somewhat of a blend. And the same over here. Just going to darken it a little bit. So right now I'm really not using a lot of water at all. It's almost a dry brush. Just enough that I can move the paint, but it's just sort of vignette. That was way too much, so I'm just gonna remove some. All right, and then that's basically it for the background. And let me see if I put this here, if it's gonna focus on it so you can see it better. There we go. So now we've got sort of a nice variety of like greens and blues, and then just some sort of overall texture on this. I might actually, there's one little thing that I'm not happy about, and it's still in here. I had a little bit too much water in my pigments there, and that's why I ended up with that kind of crazy bloom effect. So I'm just gonna add a little bit of this blue back in here and just soften this out a tiny bit. Without moving the paint too much. There we go. Now, if you wanted to do some extra little swirly fun details, like little maybe bubbles and things, you can just take your brush, dampen it a little bit. And let's say I want to do something kind of like right in here. So in terms of the line drawing that we're going to be doing, I'm putting the thicker part of the line toward this side of the page. So if I'm going to be doing any of this type of stuff, see if we put one over here, like in here maybe. I'm going to go thin on top, and I use the body of the brush to go fatter on the bottom, let it sit for just a sec, and then very carefully dab it, and I can end up with some sort of little nicks and dashes, and just some sort of interesting little marks that are maybe sort of following along in the direction of those little ripples here. So maybe do like a little, almost like cartoony. I don't want to let it sit too long because I want it to remain somewhat subtle. Just to give a little bit of extra movement. Final little details. You gotta watch out for this, that I don't put the blue side really hard on it. It's pretty much dry, but not enough. It's maybe a little bit much. You gotta be subtle with these. That's all right. Alrighty, so there we go. Got a subtly textured surface for our beautifully detailed fish to sit on. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you got something out of it or got to try maybe something new, just so you can see it better. So I will probably end up be doing the same painting twice with you guys. I'll show you the comparison with the one I did earlier during the actual class. So that's basically it. So they're similar, but they're also subtly different. I actually do think that I like this version a little bit better. It's a little bit more relaxed while doing it, I think. But there you go. So that's it. And next week, if you could have a detailer brush handy, so something that has a nice point to it, and also your India ink, we are going to do the fish. And just for those of you who maybe didn't see my video, how I work with this, and it would be great to practice. I have some little koi fish that I just drew. I don't really use any references for these ones, so they're not really perfect, but they're there. And so what I do is, I'm actually just going to take a little bit in the top of my lid. You really don't need a lot, to be honest. But I do want enough of it that it helps my brush to create a nice point. And then, so I want the lines to be darker on the bottom and lighter on the top. I also think of it as anything that's heavier would also be darker or thicker. So if you're thinking of an elephant, I might do like the biggest, darkest line sort of on the bottom of the feet, because that's where all the weight is. Or if there's like wrinkles on its leg or its knees, I would have the darker part turning under those wrinkles. So I'm sort of thinking of the same idea with the fish. So I might go kind of light on top and then press into the paper and then angle the brush up. And I'm exaggerating here, but just so you can see it. And then if this is the side that's sort of more towards the shadow, you can bring it in and then again exaggerate. And then you can thin it back out, and then it's curving again here. So what this does is it gives you a really beautiful variety of line work that just really helps to bring the drawing alive. I'm gonna go nice and soft here. So this side is sort of the side that's closer to the light. And then here, we're gonna go big. And then this, it gets really delicate at the end of the fins. So while I might add a little bit of variation into it, I'm just trying to not go as thick as the other parts. So I taper off by lightening and going more to the tip, drag it out, maybe push a little bit in, but stay on the tip. Push a little bit in and stay on the tip. So it could be a really good idea to maybe just practice with this before we go straight to our painting. This is really fun and meditative, and because the ink stays on the page, when we put watercolor over, you're going to have this beautiful line drawing to work with under your next layer of watercolors. I will also go over a few quick little techniques for drawing these things next week. So yeah, thanks so much, and I can't wait to see you guys again.